Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 11.4. With rerolling mostly gone, we've moved back to flexible playing being the strongest playstyle. That means there's a lot of diversity when it comes to usable synergies. While there's certainly a difference in power level between each tier, keep in mind that a lot of the traits are better or worse depending on the situation. Let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin, we have the synergies in the S tier. This tier consists of Dragonsoul, Slayer, Executioner, Blacksmith, and Vanguard. These synergies have a lot of influence on the current meta and are used consistently in most games. At the top of the S tier, we have Dragonsoul. Dragonsoul was rising in popularity at the end of 11.3, and in 11.4, it has solidified itself as one of the best traits in the meta. What makes Dragonsoul such a powerful synergy is how well it scales. Right from the early game up until the end of the game, it's going to be useful thanks to the increased stats that the blessing provides, and of course, the burst of damage that the blast does. One of the other reasons as to why Dragonsoul is doing well are the champions themselves. It has multiple late game carries with Aurelion, Olaf, and Swain, while having solid early to mid game champions like Tristana, Brand, and Shyvana. These factors all come together to make Dragonsoul a top tier trait for flexible players. Another trait that exemplifies flexible play is Slayer. Slayer isn't quite as good as Dragonsoul at scaling all game, but once you enter the mid to late game, you're going to find a lot of players running some variant of the trait. Whether that's with Olaf as the carry, Tryndamere, or simply waiting until late game with Samira. Even Zed is still playable as a Slayer carry, though he's not quite as common as he used to be. Next, we have Executioner, which is not that flexible of a synergy, but is still top tier nonetheless. Kael's the main reason the synergy is doing well because she's a solid mid to late game carry. But since Executioner relies so heavily on Kael, that means if you're not able to 2-star her or don't have good items for her, then the chances of placing high are much lower. Basically think of Executioner as a 1st or 8th synergy, whereas Dragonsoul and Slayer are better for consistent top 4s. Up next is the S tier mainstay of set 4.5, Blacksmith. The artifacts that Ornn creates are, in general, quite good and will often increase the chances of your board to win rounds. Of course, there is a difference in power between the artifacts, but hitting a strong one like Eternal Winter is going to boost the strength of your board by a large amount. And for the last synergy in S tier, we have Vanguard. Vanguard is still the premier frontline synergy for the current meta, especially with Brawlers receiving a nerf in 11.4. Overall, the defensive stats make Vanguard champions ideal frontliners, but more importantly, most of them have some form of crowd control. Aatrox, Sejuani, and Ornn can fit into any composition and provide a huge boon to your board with their CC. Even Nautilus has a place in the meta with Vanguard Mystic rising in popularity. That's going to be it for the S tier, so let's now move on to the synergies in the A tier. This tier consists of Daredevil, Syphoner, Mage, Divine, Cultist, Elderwood, Mystic, Assassin, and Brawler. These synergies are commonly used in top 4 comps and are all around consistently useful. Kicking off the A tier, we have Daredevil. Samira is still one of the best late game 5 cost champions, though she did receive a slight nerf as her attack range went down. This hasn't really affected her too much, but it's worth keeping in mind as positioning her isn't as easy anymore. Overall, though, with Slayer being a top trait, Samira is an easy choice to throw onto any late game board. Next, we have Syphoner, which is one of the strongest splash traits in the current meta. Syphoner just fits so well into multiple comps, especially with those using either Slayer or Dragonsoul. This is mainly due to Swain, as he enables several synergies and is a late game powerhouse himself. Unfortunately, Nasus has fallen off after several nerfs, so this trait does rely mainly on Morgana and Swain to carry it. Interestingly enough, Mage is not only doing well just because of Aurelion Sol. Okay, yes, he is a major factor in the viability of Mage as a whole, but Veigar is a viable option as a secondary carry. Plus, there's the occasional Twisted Fate or even Brand carry depending on the game. Basically, Mage has far more applications in the current meta than it has in the past, and while Aurelion Sol is the best Mage, he's not the only Mage. Divine, unfortunately, is back to relying entirely upon Kael to be relevant in the meta. With Nasus carry being killed off by the nerf bat, there's no other viable carry for Divine to be used besides for Kael. Luckily, it's such a useful trait for Kael that Divine is naturally pulled up in value. That said, if you're not playing Kael, then it's likely that you won't find much use for the trait. The surprise of 11.4 is the rise of Cultist. Essentially what has happened with all the nerfs that happened in 11.4, Cultist as a whole has gained a lot of value because it was untouched. In fact, 9 Cultists were buffed. Mixed into that is the shift away from rerolling, so having a strong mid-game is important again, and 6 Cultists is one of the best mid-games you can have. There's still a lot of issues with scaling of Cultists as they don't have a solid late-game carry, but as far as the early to mid-game goes, Cultist is one of the best. Elderwood clings on to relevancy mostly due to Aurelion Sol, though Vanguard is a decent secondary option as a carry. Xayah is alright, but with so many players contesting her in Executioner comps, it's difficult to make her the main carry for Elderwoods. But overall, Elderwood is an average tier defensive trait that's just there to provide a frontline for Aurelion. There's quite a bit of magic damage in the meta, which means Mystic is going to be useful as a splash trait. In addition to that, we've seen the rise of Vanguard Mystic as a top tier comp. But when we're talking about Mystic, it's mainly because of how easy it is to splash into most comps. Assassin is in an interesting spot for the meta, as there's several carries that rely on it, such as Akali, Katarina, and Talon. But none of those carries will really do that well in the late game. For the most part, we're seeing Assassin used in the early and mid game. That's alright, as having a strong board during those parts of the game is important in the current meta. And for the last synergy in the A tier, we have Brawlers. Brawlers may honestly deserve to be a spot lower on the tier, but we're keeping them at the end of A tier due to the strength that they have in the early game. If you can secure Shyvana 2, they still do well in the mid game. But once the game enters stage 4 and beyond, Brawlers will fall off drastically, so keep that in mind when using them as your frontline. Let's now move on to the B tier synergies. This tier consists of Spirit, Fabled, Sharpshooter, Duelist, Exile, Warlord, Emperor, Adept, and the Boss. Overall, these synergies are capable of doing well in the current meta, but for the most part are just average at best. At the top of the B tier, we have Spirit. Spirit took a bit of a beating in 11.4 as several compositions that used it were nerfed. Zed has fallen off while Diana is no longer a consistent carry. But as far as being used as a splash trait, Spirit is still going strong, but finding a way to fit it into most comps may prove difficult. Fabled has risen up in the meta thanks in part to all of the nerfs dished out in 11.4. Plus, the meta is slowed down since rerolling is weaker, which means Fabled has a chance to come online in the mid-game. Overall, Fabled really does well with Vanguard Mystic and is essentially non-existent outside of that build. Sharpshooters are doing better in the meta with Sivir rising up as a mid-game carry, but the trait took a heavy hit with Nidalee 3 being nerfed into oblivion. Consider Sharpshooter almost like a splash trait and not nearly the type of synergy you focus on for carrying. Duelist got hit by several nerfs which have lowered it back to being a mid-tier comp at best. It's still a viable trait to use, but it will be weaker in the early and mid-game than it was previously, which makes it far less consistent. Going hand in hand with Duelist is Exiled, as Yasuo is one of the champions that got nerfed in 11.4. While he's still an okay champion during Stage 2, he's far less likely to be used as a carry than he was before. Of course, there is still Yone to carry Exile, but in reality, when you're thinking about Exile as a trait, it's more about Yasuo in the early game. Yone really doesn't need Exile to do well. Sadly, patch 11.4 took Warlords down several pegs in the meta, as both the trait itself and Katarina got heavy-handed nerfs. Katarina is still a viable mid-game carry, and while you can still scale into the late game with her if you 3-star her, overall Warlords are back to being a stage 3 synergy, and that's it. Next up is Emperor, which is still an underwhelming trait. Azir is still a great 5-cost champion, though with both Keeper and Warlords being weaker in the late game, his place in the meta is mostly first crowd control. That said, his Sandguards do have use in baiting out abilities from champions like Aatrox or Aurelion Sol, but with target dumbing being in the game, the Sandguards no longer have a unique role. Still, Azir is great, so we can't be too harsh on this trait. It's difficult to find a spot for Adept in the meta. Overall, it's still commonly used as a splash trait since Aurelia is used for Divine, Shen can be splashed in for Mystic, and Yone is a strong late game champ. But the issue is how useful is Adept? It's good against champions like Aurelion Sol that don't attack quickly or have scaling, but champions like Olaf and Kayle don't really care that much about being slowed. Thus, Adept is in a weird limbo state of being a useful splash trait, but also not being that useful as it's entirely dependent upon the lobby. And the last trait in the B tier is the Boss. Set is kind of a niche 5-cost in the current meta. Overall, he does provide good damage against late game champions if he's 2-starred, but finding a place in your composition for him is really difficult outside of maybe Elderwoods. And now we can move on to the last tier, the C tier. This tier consists of Ninja, Keeper, Enlightened, and Fortune. These synergies are useful in the right situation, but have less of an impact on the meta than the tiers above them. Ninja fell off pretty substantially in 11.4. For the most part, they've been replaced by Assassin compositions or Slayer in the case of Zed. Individually, the units are fantastic, but as a 4-piece trait, you're really not going to see it used that often. Okay, so keepers are great early game, fall off in stage 4, and are basically useless late game. That drastic fall off in the mid game is the main reason why keepers are so low on the tier list. But they are really good early game, so don't bypass them early just because they're weaker later on. Enlightened is still in the same place as it's been for a while. It has useful champions like Morgana and occasionally Talon, but the trait itself just doesn't matter that much. And essentially it has no real value outside of those two champions, especially with Fiora receiving a nerf. Enlightened definitely needs some love in future patches to make it more of a well-rounded trait. And the last trait for patch 11.4 is Fortune. We want to make it clear that Fortune is not a bad synergy if used well. It's only rated so low on the tier list because most players are going to get baited by it and likely end up losing the game because of it. Since it's not that great of a synergy for the majority of players, we have to place it at the bottom. But we're well aware that in the right hands, Fortune can do really well. That's going to be it for today's tier list video. Even though the top of the meta is still dominated by Dragonsoul and Slayer, we're still seeing a good amount of secondary synergies being used. More than likely, we'll see a more balanced meta in patch 11.5, as this patch has been somewhat chaotic due to all the nerfs. Let us know in the comment section below what traits you're having the most success with that aren't Dragonsoul, Slayer, and Executioner. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.